She sat still in seat 9, a head bowed, clutching a tattered cloth bag so ragged the flight attendant had to ask, "Do you need a sedative?" A man chuckled. Look at her, shaking, probably her first time flying. But then the cockpit speakers whispered a strange phrase, "Night Viper, 9 if you're still alive. Please come to the cockpit." The entire cabin fell silent. The woman everyone had dismissed rose to her feet, and with a single code, the entire flight crew bowed their heads before her. Rachel Moore didn't look like much to anyone on that plane. Her gray hoodie was faded, the cuffs frayed from years of wear. Her khaki pants hung loose, the hems scuffed from dragging on too many floors. Her shoes were worse old sneakers, with soles so thin you could see the shape of her toes. Her face was gaunt pale with dark circles carved deep under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. Her black hair fell soft and loose, not styled just there, like she didn't care who noticed. But her eyes, those were different. Sharp. Piercing, like they could cut through steel if she wanted them to. Nobody saw that, though. Not at first. They saw the bag, the clothes, the slouch. They saw someone who didn't belong on an international VIP flight from Brussels to Alaska. The plane was packed with people who mattered, or thought they did. Business tycoons in tailored suits, diplomats with polished briefcases, a couple of influencers snapping selfies in first class. The air buzzed with their confidence, their loud laughs, their clinking glasses. Rachel sat alone, her hands folded over that bag, her gaze fixed on the seatback in front of her. The guy next to her, some young hotshot in an Armani suit, kept glancing her way, his lip curling like he smelled something bad. When the plane hit a patch of turbulence, just a light shake, Rachel's head snapped up. She stared at the overhead displays, her brow furrowing, like she was reading something nobody else could see. The guy leaned over, smirking. "You know how to read those." His voice was loud enough for the rows around them to hear. A few people snickered. A flight attendant, a tall woman with a tight bun and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leaned in. "If you're nervous, maybe try reading the in-flight magazine." Her tone was sweet, but it dripped with pity, like she was talking to a child. Rachel didn't answer. She just looked at the attendant, her eyes steady, unblinking. The woman shifted uncomfortable and walked away. Across the aisle, a little girl, maybe 7, tugged at her mom's sleeve. "Why does that lady look like she's about to cry?" She whispered loud enough for Rachel to hear. The mom's eyes darted to Rachel, then away. She pulled her daughter close like Rachel was something to shield her from. "Shh, don't stare," she muttered, turning her back. A businessman in a pinstripe suit, his tie clipped with a gold emblem, stood to stretch his legs. He glanced at Rachel, then at the flight attendant nearby, his voice low but cutting. "Why is someone like her even allowed in this section?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks. Rachel's fingers paused on her bag just for a second before she resumed adjusting the strap. The attendant hesitated, then offered a tight smile. "We'll handle it, sir." The businessman nodded satisfied and sat back down, but his eyes lingered on Rachel like she was a stain on his perfect flight. She didn't look at him. Instead, she pulled her hoodie tighter around her shoulders, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was anchoring herself against the weight of his words. The cabin kept moving, people chatting, sipping drinks, scrolling phones. But Rachel felt the weight of their glances, the whispers, the judgment. It wasn't new to her, but it still stung like a paper cut. You don't notice until it burns. She didn't flinch, though, didn't fidget. She just sat there, hands still on that bag, her face calm, but her jaw tight like she was holding something back. Nobody knew what. Nobody cared to ask. "Hey, before we go on, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to keep sharing stories like this. Stories that hit deep, that remind us what it's like to be human. Thanks for being here. Now let's keep going." The plane hummed along the engines, a steady drone. But the mood in the cabin shifted when a man in a crisp navy suit stood up. He was maybe 50, with a Rolex glinting on his wrist and a voice that carried like he owned the place. "Excuse me," he said, waving down a steward. "I don't feel comfortable sitting near that woman." He nodded toward Rachel, his mouth twisting like he had bitten something sour. The steward, a young guy with a nervous smile, glanced at Rachel, then back at the man. "Sir, I'm sure it's fine," he started, but the man cut him off. "I paid for a VIP experience. She doesn't belong here." His voice was loud, deliberate, like he wanted everyone to hear. As the steward led Rachel to the back, a woman in a sleek blazer, her nails painted a glossy red, leaned toward her friend. "Can you believe they let her on this flight?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. She pulled out a compact mirror, checking her lipstick, then snapped it shut. It's embarrassing, really? Rachel's steps didn't falter, but her hand brushed against her bag, her fingers lingering on a small frayed patch sewn into the side. It was barely noticeable, but the stitching formed a faint outline of a delta symbol faded from years of wear. Nobody saw it. They were too busy staring at her worn shoes, her hunched posture, her silence. The steward motioned to a seat near the toilets, where the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant. Rachel sat down her bag on her lap, her eyes scanning the cabin briefly before settling on the floor. The woman in the silk scarf from earlier clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursed. A man in a tailored coat leaned over to his colleague, his voice low but clear. Bet she's some kind of charity case snuck in with a fake ticket. His colleague nodded, smirking, and pulled out his phone to check its stocks. Rachel's fingers tightened on her bag, the knuckles whitening, but her face stayed calm, unreadable like a lake with no ripples. A woman in her 60s, her hair dyed a sharp platinum blonde, sat a few rows ahead, her fingers tapping impatiently on a leather-bound notebook. She turned to the man beside her, her voice crisp and commanding. "I've flown this route for years, and I've never seen someone so out of place," she said, her eyes narrowing at Rachel. "It's an insult to the rest of us." The man nodded, adjusting his glasses, and muttered, "Standards are slipping." Rachel's hand stilled on her bag, her fingers brushing a small worn zipper. For a moment, her thumb lingered there, as if tracing a memory, but her face gave nothing away. The woman's words hung in the air, sharp and cold, as the cabin lights dimmed slightly. In the cockpit, things were different. The co-pilot, a wiry guy named Jenkins with a buzz cut and a nervous habit of tapping his foot, was staring at the cabin camera feed. His eyes locked on Rachel, and his breath caught. "Captain," he said, his voice low, "you see the woman in 9A, now at the back." The captain, a grizzled man named Ryan with 20 years in the air, glanced at the screen and frowned. "What about her?" Jenkins leaned closer, his fingers flying over the emergency passenger database. "Has anyone ever vetted her?" he asked. 10 seconds later, his face went pale. She was declared dead 6 years ago, but her retinal scan matches 100%. Ryan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "If that's really her, this flight might just be saved." He issued a silent order through the crew's earpieces. "Protect her. Don't say her codename aloud." From that moment, the crew moved differently around Rachel, their eyes lingering their steps, careful like they were walking near something fragile and dangerous. A young influencer, her hair perfectly curled, stood up to adjust her overhead bag. She glanced at Rachel, then turned to the man next to her, her voice loud enough to carry. "I mean, seriously, who lets someone like that on a plane like this?" She flipped her hair, pulling out her phone to take a selfie, angling it to catch Rachel in the background. "This is going viral," she muttered, typing a caption. "Who is this mess on my VIP flight?" Rachel's eyes flicked toward her just for a moment, sharp enough to make the influencer pause mid-type. But Rachel said nothing, just shifted her bag to the floor, her movements slow like she was measuring every second. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, harder this time. The cabin shook and a few people gasped. Rachel's head snapped up again, her eyes on the overhead displays. The Armani guy from earlier smirked, leaning toward the man next to him. "Bet she thinks the plane's gonna crash," he said, loud enough for her to hear. Rachel didn't look at him. She just shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag like she was checking something inside. The moment passed, but the air felt heavier, like something was coming. A man in a navy blazer, his cufflinks gleaming under the cabin lights, stood to retrieve a drink from the galley. As he passed Rachel, he paused, his eyes raking over her faded hoodie. "You know they have dress codes for flights like this," he said, his voice smooth but laced with mockery. He sipped his drink, ice clinking, and leaned closer just enough to make her feel the intrusion. "Maybe next time, try a little harder." Rachel's hand stilled on her bag, her fingers curling slightly, but she didn't look up. Instead, she adjusted her sleeve, revealing a faint tattoo on her wrist, a small coiled viper barely visible. The man didn't notice already, walking away, chuckling to himself, as the other passengers smirked. Then it happened. A sharp beep cut through the cabin. The lights flickered. The plane lurched, veering hard to the left. People screamed, drinks spilled, bags slid out from under seats. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but tight. "Folks, we're experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated." In the cockpit, the autopilot system was dead. The screens flashed red error codes piling up. Jenkins muttered, "All emergency overrides are failing." Ryan's hands were steady on the controls, but his face was grim. "There's only one option left," Jenkins said, his voice shaking. Ryan nodded, picked up the radio, and whispered into the intercom, "Night Viper 9, if you're listening. We need you." Rachel stood. The cabin was chaos. People shouting, a baby crying, someone praying in the corner. She moved down the aisle, her steps slow deliberate, her bag still in her hand. The steward who'd moved her earlier stepped aside, his eyes wide. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She walked to the cockpit door, knocked once, and it opened. The passengers stared, their voices dropping to whispers. She walked into the cockpit like it's a grocery store. A man in a polo shirt scoffed, his face red with indignation. A woman with a press badge streaming on her phone spoke fast. Unknown woman, accessing flight controls, possibly self-claimed ex-military. A middle-aged man in a cashmere sweater, his glasses perched low on his nose, stood up, his voice booming. "This is outrageous," he shouted, pointing at the cockpit door. "She's putting us all at risk." He turned to the passengers around him, rallying them like a lawyer in a courtroom. "We deserve answers. Who is she?" A few people nodded, their faces tight with fear and anger. Rachel's bag left on her seat slid slightly as the plane tilted. A corner of it caught the light, revealing a faint metallic glint, a small pin barely noticeable shaped like a viper's head. Nobody saw it. They were too busy shouting, their voices overlapping in a wave of panic. Inside the cockpit, Rachel set her bag down. Her eyes darkened, scanning the screens. "How many minutes before we lose full thrust control?" she asked, her voice low, steady. Ryan didn't hesitate. 7, he said. She nodded, her fingers moving to a panel nobody else had touched. A passenger outside the cockpit, a heavy-set guy with a tech company logo on his jacket, banged on the door. "Who gave her permission to touch that?" he yelled. Another voice, sharp and female, joined in. "We're not safe with a woman like her flying." Rachel didn't flinch. She unlocked a hidden screen, her fingers typing a code, DRXNV9. It shouldn't have worked. That code was deleted from every military database years ago. But the screen lit up green and alive. The monitor flashed, 0 Delta officer identity, restored command access granted. Ryan and Jenkins stood, stepping back, offering her the chair. Rachel didn't sit. She put on the headset, her movements precise, like she'd done this 1,000 times. "Requesting encrypted flight path," she said into the mic. A classified military map appeared on the screen, showing a hostile aerial unit closing in on their position. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "I took one of those down in 2021, she muttered. "I'll do it again." The cockpit was silent, except for the hum of the systems and the faint crackle of her headset. Outside, the passengers were losing it. A woman in a designer dress, her pearls clicking as she moved, stood up, her face flushed. "This is a disgrace," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "She's probably some hacker messing with the systems." She turned to the steward, jabbing a finger toward the cockpit. "Do something." The steward froze, his hands raised, unsure how to respond. Rachel's fingers paused on the controls just for a second, as if she'd heard the outburst. Then she kept working, her face unchanging. Her eyes locked on the radar. A faint beep sounded, and the plane's systems began to stabilize, the red warnings fading one by one. "She's flying the plane illegally." A woman in a red blazer screamed, her voice carrying over the chaos. She was a politician, her face familiar from cable news. "Arrest her the moment we land." Another passenger, a guy with slicked back hair and a gold watch, was texting furiously. "Unknown female hijacking. Flight 1407, he typed, sending it to a news outlet. A young flight attendant, barely 20, slipped her phone out and started filming Rachel through the cockpit window. Rachel didn't notice. Her eyes were locked on the radar, her fingers steady on the control column, guiding the plane through a series of gentle banks to avoid the approaching threat. In the cabin, a man in a leather jacket, his beard neatly trimmed, leaned forward, his voice low but venomous. "I bet she's just some wannabe pilot who watched too many movies," he said to the woman next to him, who nodded, her eyes wide. He stood, craning his neck to see into the cockpit. "Look at her acting like she owns the place." Rachel's hand moved to adjust a dial, her movements so precise they seemed almost mechanical. The plane's shaking eased, but the man kept talking, his voice growing louder. "She's going to get us all killed." A few passengers murmured in agreement, their fear feeding his words. The plane stabilized, the shaking easing. The passengers quieted, but the tension didn't break. They kept staring at the cockpit door, whispering, pointing. A man in a suit jacket leaned toward his wife. Does she think this is a video game? He said, shaking his head. Rachel's hands moved faster now, recalibrating systems, rerouting power. The screen stopped flashing red. The plane leveled out. But the voices outside didn't stop. She should be arrested for impersonation. A woman shouted, her voice shrill. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was in control. A quiet moment passed in the cockpit. The only sound, the soft hum of the systems. Ryan glanced at Rachel, his hands still on the co-pilot's controls, and noticed a small scar on her wrist barely visible under her sleeve. It was jagged like a burn, and it stirred a memory a briefing years ago about a pilot who'd survived a crash. No one should have. He didn't say anything, but his grip on the controls loosened like he was handing over more than just the plane. Rachel's eyes flicked to a secondary screen where a faint signal blinked, an old distress code one only a handful of people would recognize. She didn't react, just kept working her fingers steady, her breathing even. A flight attendant, her uniform slightly wrinkled from the chaos, hesitated near the cockpit door. She clutched a tray of coffee cups, her hands shaking slightly. She'd heard the captain's whisper over the intercom, the name Night Viper 9, and it hit her like a jolt. Her uncle, a retired Air Force mechanic, used to tell stories about a pilot who could fly through hell and come out untouched. She glanced at Rachel, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she stepped back, her tray rattling. Rachel's eyes met hers for a split second, and the attendant's face flushed. She knew she was in the presence of someone who carried a weight the rest of them couldn't fathom. A buzz cut through the cockpit speakers. A secure encrypted frequency. Viper 9 confirmed status. Do you require landing support? The voice was military clipped, urgent. Rachel's response was immediate. Negative. I have control. Activate Phantom 7 runway. On the ground, a secret landing strip unused for 6 years, lit up. Jenkins stared at her, his mouth open. Ryan's eyes were wet, his voice barely above a whisper. You're alive, and still the only one I'd trust with my life. The plane banked gently, the cabin settling. The panic in the air started to fade, but not the suspicion. As the plane descended, a young mother in the back row, her baby asleep in her arms, watched Rachel through the cockpit window. Her face softened, and she whispered to the man next to her, "She's not scared. Look at her hands, they're steady." The man, a quiet guy in a flannel shirt who'd stayed silent through the chaos, nodded slowly. "She's done this before." He said, his voice low, like he was piecing something together. Rachel adjusted the headset, her fingers brushing the mic, and for a moment her lips moved as if whispering something to herself. Nobody heard it, but the mother kept watching, her eyes wide, like she'd seen a glimpse of something extraordinary. The landing was smooth, almost silent. The plane touched down on the Phantom 7 runway, a strip hidden in the Alaskan wilderness surrounded by snow-dusted mountains. Reporters were already there, somehow tipped off, crowding the tarmac with cameras and microphones. As Rachel stepped out of the cockpit, the passengers stared, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. "What's your name?" A reporter shouted, shoving a mic toward her. "Are you impersonating someone?" Another voice, sharp and official, cut through. "Ma'am, step this way," a man in a black suit said, gesturing to a security van. A passenger, the same guy who'd filmed her earlier, pushed forward. "Answer us. Are you really some secret agent?" A teenage girl, her earbuds dangling, stood frozen near the exit, her phone still in her hand. She'd been scrolling through social media, but now her eyes were on Rachel. "Wait," she said, her voice barely audible. "I saw her face somewhere." She scrolled back through her feed, landing on an old post, a blurry photo from a military forum showing a woman in a pilot's uniform, her face half hidden by a helmet. The caption read, "The Ghost of Unit 0 Delta." The girl's hands shook as she showed it to her dad, who frowned, then looked at Rachel with something like awe. Rachel didn't see it. She was already moving toward the air stair, her bag slung over her shoulder. Rachel didn't speak. She handed the headset to Ryan, her movements slow, deliberate. She walked down the air stair, her bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The crowd parted, not because they wanted to, but because something in her presence made them. She didn't look back. Not once. The reporters kept shouting, the cameras kept flashing, but she was already gone, disappearing into the cold Alaskan air. On the tarmac, a young soldier barely out of training stood guard near the security van. His hands trembled as he saluted Rachel, his eyes wide with recognition. He'd heard the stories, whispers in the barracks about a pilot who'd outflown death itself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking, "it's an honor." Rachel paused just for a moment, her eyes meeting his. She nodded a small gesture, but it was enough to make the soldier stand taller, his chest swelling with pride. The reporters didn't catch it. They were too busy shouting questions. The next day, the world changed. A leaked military video hit the internet, grainy but unmistakable. Rachel, 6 years younger in a cockpit, her face focused, her hands steady as she rerouted a bomb-laden UAV away from a civilian zone. The headline spread like wildfire. Night Viper 9, the only pilot who survived an erased mission. News outlets scrambled to issue apologies. "We misjudged her," one anchor said, her voice shaking. "We all did." The Department of Defense released a statement, short and final. "We are alive today, thanks to the woman the world forgot." The fallout was quiet, but real. The CEO who'd complained about sitting near her. His company lost a major defense contract the next week. His name dragged through the mud online. The politician who'd screamed for her arrest. Her campaign tanked after the video went viral, her donors pulling out overnight. The guy who'd filmed her posting strange woman on Flight 1407. His social media account was suspended, his sponsorships gone by morning. The flight attendant who'd recorded Rachel in the cockpit. She was let go, her name blacklisted from every major airline. Nobody said Rachel did it. Nobody had to. The truth was enough. The influencer who'd posted Rachel's photo online sat in her hotel room that night, her phone buzzing with notifications. Her post had backfired, thousands of comments called her out, her followers dropping by the hour. She stared at the screen, her perfectly curled hair now limp, her hands shaking as she deleted the post. It was too late. The internet didn't forget. Rachel's face, once mocked, was now a symbol of something bigger. The influencer sank into her chair, her confidence gone, her reflection in the mirror showing a stranger. Rachel never spoke to the press, never went on TV, never showed up to claim her moment. The military tried to reach her, but she was gone. Her name became a whisper, a legend in quiet corners of the internet. Flight 1407 kept running its route, Brussels to Alaska, but seat 9A stayed empty. Always, like it was waiting for her to come back. A week later, a retired pilot, his hair gray and his hands worn from years at the controls, sat in a small bar in Anchorage. He overheard two locals talking about the flight, about the woman who'd saved it. He set his glass down, his voice quiet but firm. "I flew with her once," he said, his eyes distant. "She was the best, never needed to prove it." The locals leaned in, but he didn't say more. He just raised his glass a silent toast and looked out at the snow falling outside. She didn't. Rachel Moore, Night Viper 9, walked away that day, her bag over her shoulder, her eyes still sharp, still cutting through the noise. She'd been judged, mocked, dismissed. But she'd stood her ground. Not with words, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet strength that lingers long after the cameras stop rolling. For everyone who'd ever been looked down on, who'd felt the sting of being less than, her silence said it all. You weren't wrong, you weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.